Picture this, a landscape bleached white as bone, where twisted metal skeletons rise from cracked earth, where dead trees stand sentinel over collapsed walls, where the very air tastes of salt and memory. This is Villa Epecuén today, 600 kilometers southwest of Buenos Aires, where the ruins of an entire civilization emerge from receding waters like a drowned Atlantis slowly exhaling its secrets. Buildings crumble under crusts of crystallized salt. Rusted bed frames poke through debris like ribs through decaying flesh. Staircases lead to nowhere, their destinations consumed by time and brine. The wind howls through empty window frames, carrying with it the whispers of 1,500 vanished lives, the echoes of prosperity turned to dust, the bitter taste of ambition drowned in its own excess. 25,000 tourists now visit these ruins annually, the same number who once flocked here for healing and luxury. But what they find today is not restoration, but revelation. What dark bargain did this place strike with ambition? What hubris transformed paradise into purgatory? And what does this ghost town whisper about the price we pay when we build our dreams on unstable ground, when we construct entire worlds on foundations we know, somewhere deep in our souls, cannot possibly hold? The story begins not with catastrophe, but with promise, with the kind of glittering vision that has always driven human ambition forward, that transforms empty land into fortunes, that sees profit where others see only wilderness. In the early 20th century, long before the flood, before the ruin, before the salt-encrusted silence that now defines this place, there was water. Lago Epecuén, a salt lake nestled in the pampas grasslands of Buenos Aires province, had been known to indigenous peoples for centuries, had been witness to their ceremonies, their healings, their understanding of the land that predated maps and property deeds and entrepreneurial schemes. Local legend claimed the lake was born from the tears of a great chief, salted by his grief over a lost love, his sorrow so profound it carved a basin in the earth and filled it with water 10 times salter than the ocean. Whether poetry or truth, whether myth or memory, the lake possessed extraordinary properties that could not be dismissed or explained away by skeptics. Its mineral-rich waters contained concentrations of sodium carbonate, magnesium, calcium, and other elements that rivaled the Dead Sea, that made the water impossibly dense, impossibly buoyant, impossibly healing. Indigenous communities had long recognized its therapeutic potential, bathing in its briny depths to treat ailments, to soothe aching bodies worn by labor and time, to find relief that conventional medicine could not provide. But healing water alone does not build empires. Raw natural resources, no matter how remarkable, require transformation into capital, require the intervention of vision and marketing and that particular kind of entrepreneurial hunger that characterized Argentina's so-called Golden Age, that era when the country was among the world's wealthiest, when Buenos Aires styled itself the Paris of South America, when everything seemed possible and prosperity seemed inevitable and permanent. Enter an English developer whose name has been largely lost to history, swallowed by time and flood and the general indifference toward those whose schemes ultimately fail, but whose ambitions were not small, whose vision was grand, whose understanding of human desire was acute. In the early 1920s, this unnamed Englishman secured a lease on the land surrounding Lago Epecuén, paying whoever claimed ownership, navigating whatever bureaucracy existed, positioning himself to transform this remote corner of the Pampas into something that could generate serious wealth. He understood something fundamental about money and desire, about the economics of hope. People will travel great distances and pay substantial sums for the promise of transformation, for the possibility of becoming different, better, healthier versions of themselves. The waters, he decided with the certainty of all great promoters, would become Argentina's premier therapeutic destination, a place spoken about in the same breath as European spas, a place where the wealthy would come not as visitors but as pilgrims seeking miracles. To legitimize his claims, to transform folk wisdom into marketable science, he hired Italian scientists to study the lake's composition and document its curative properties in language that would convince educated, skeptical, wealthy patrons that this was not mere superstition but genuine medicine. Their reports were favorable, clinically validating what indigenous wisdom had known for generations but lacked the institutional authority to monetize. The water could treat rheumatism, that affliction of aging bodies and manual labor. It could address skin conditions, those visible markers of illness that isolated sufferers from polite society. It could even, the report suggested with careful hedging that left room for hope without legal liability, help manage diabetes, that mysterious disease that was becoming increasingly common as diets changed and lifestyles shifted. Here was medicine disguised as leisure, profit wrapped in the language of wellness, exploitation dressed in the robes of healing. The marketing was brilliant because it was partially true, because the water did possess genuine properties, because people who bathed in Villa Epecuén often did feel better, whether from the minerals or the placebo effect or simply the relief of escaping their ordinary lives for a few days of rest beside still water under endless sky. In 1921, Villa Epecuén was formally established on the eastern shore of the lake, given a name, given structure, given the administrative reality that transforms empty land into a place on maps. The name itself was strategic, evocative, maintaining a connection to indigenous legend while signaling something new, something modern, something that belonged to the 20th century's promise of progress and prosperity. The vision was ambitious from the beginning: transform this remote corner of the Pampas into Argentina's answer to European spa towns, a place where the wealthy of Buenos Aires could escape urban pressures and immerse themselves in healing waters under skies unmarred by industrial smoke, a place where the middle classes could aspire to visit, could save for years to afford, could tell their friends about with pride. The location was strategically perfect. Far enough from the capital to feel like genuine escape, like another world entirely, but close enough for weekend visits, for short holidays that did not require the expense and commitment of international travel. Within a year, a railroad station connected Villa Epecuén to Buenos Aires, making the journey accessible to the upper and middle classes who could afford such indulgences, who had the leisure time to spend days soaking in salt water, who had the disposable income to pay for hotels and treatments and the elaborate performance of genteel resort life. The town grew with remarkable speed, with the kind of explosive development that happens when capital identifies opportunity and rushes to exploit it before competitors arrive. Hotels sprouted along the shoreline, their balconies overlooking the glittering expanse of salt water that was simultaneously natural wonder and economic engine. Guest houses and lodges multiplied to accommodate the increasing flow of visitors who arrived every summer season, their numbers swelling year after year as word spread about Villa Epecuén's healing properties, as testimonials circulated, as the town established itself as a legitimate destination rather than a speculative venture. Restaurants appeared to serve elaborate meals to guests who expected the same quality they enjoyed in Buenos Aires. Shops opened selling souvenirs, necessities, luxury goods. Entertainment venues provided evening diversions for visitors who had spent their days in therapeutic waters but still expected amusement after dark. The town was not just a collection of buildings but an entire infrastructure designed around the single purpose of extracting wealth from tourists while making them feel pampered, healed, transformed. By the 1940s, Villa Epecuén had established itself as a significant presence in Argentina's tourism economy, no longer a speculative venture but a proven success. By the 1960s, it was genuinely thriving, expanding beyond its original boundaries, developing neighborhoods for permanent residents, creating the structures of ordinary life alongside the extraordinary business of selling healing. By the 1970s, at its absolute peak, at the moment when it seemed most permanent, most successful, most secure in its prosperity, the town could accommodate 5,000 visitors simultaneously, with unofficial accommodations in private homes and improvised spaces pushing total capacity to 7,000. The permanent population reached 1,500 residents, ordinary working people whose livelihoods depended entirely on the never-ending stream of tourists seeking the healing waters, whose entire existence revolved around serving others, whose futures were mortgaged against the assumption that the tourists would always come, that the prosperity would continue indefinitely, that nothing fundamental would change. What was it like, this town in its golden age, in those years when everything seemed possible and permanent? Photographs from the 1970s show a bustling lakeside resort, crowded beaches where families gathered, children splashing in the shallow, impossibly buoyant salt water that held them up like invisible hands, parents watching from the shore with the relaxed satisfaction of vacation well spent. The mineral content was so high that swimmers could lie back and float effortlessly, reading newspapers while the water supported them, creating the surreal image of people reclining on nothing, suspended between water and sky, defying expectations of how bodies should behave in liquid. Hotels advertised therapeutic mud baths where patrons covered themselves in mineral-rich sediment from the lake bottom, transforming into clay figures who baked in the sun before washing clean in salt water. They promoted salt water pools for those who wanted the healing properties without the unpredictability of the lake itself. They offered treatments combining modern medicine with ancient practice, bringing doctors and nurses to apply clinical expertise to therapeutic waters, creating a hybrid approach that satisfied both skeptics and believers. The town boasted 280 businesses at its height, a remarkable number for a permanent population of 1,500, reflecting the massive seasonal influx that drove the economy. There were department stores stocked with goods from Buenos Aires, ensuring visitors did not have to sacrifice urban conveniences for rural healing. There were cinemas showing the latest films, providing evening entertainment after long days spent in water and sun. There was a slaughterhouse to supply fresh meat, a necessity given the remote location and the number of mouths to feed during peak season. There were schools for the children of permanent residents, those kids who grew up in a town that transformed dramatically with the seasons, that was sometimes intimate and sometimes overwhelmed, that was both home and workplace. There was a cemetery on the outskirts where the town's founding families were buried, where the graves accumulated generation by generation, creating layers of history, proving that people had built genuine lives here, had marked the land with their deaths as much as their labor. There were bars where workers drank after shifts, washing away the exhaustion of serving demanding tourists, finding solidarity in shared grievances and jokes that only they would understand. There were churches where they prayed, seeking meaning and comfort in rituals older than the town, older than the resort industry, older than the idea of healing waters as commodities to be sold. There were parks where young people courted and older people gossiped and children played games that had nothing to do with tourism or economics or the elaborate performance of resort town life. There were homes where families fought and reconciled and celebrated and mourned, where the ordinary dramas of human existence unfolded behind closed doors, invisible to the tourists who saw only the pleasant facades, the smiling service workers, the carefully maintained illusion that Villa Epecuén existed solely for their benefit and pleasure, but beneath the prosperity, beneath the cheerful tourism brochures and the testimonials about miraculous cures and the photographs of happy families. Floating in impossible water, there existed another reality that few acknowledged and fewer documented. The workers who made Villa Epecuén function, the maids who cleaned hotel rooms and changed linens and scrubbed bathrooms used by strangers, the cooks who prepared elaborate meals in overheated kitchens while wealthy guests complained about minor imperfections, the groundskeepers who maintained the beaches and picked up trash and ensured the waterfront remained picturesque, the mechanics who kept ancient vehicles running with improvised parts and determination. These people lived precarious lives entirely dependent on seasonal tourism. When summer ended and Buenos Aires visitors returned to their comfortable urban lives, what happened to those whose entire existence revolved around serving them? The hotels reduced staff to skeleton crews. The restaurants closed or operated with limited menus. The shops shuttered their windows. The town contracted into itself, waiting for the next season, hoping it would come, praying the tourists would return. The wealth that flowed through Villa Epecuén during peak season, the substantial sums paid for rooms and treatments and meals and entertainment, did not accumulate locally in any meaningful way. It flowed out, back to Buenos Aires investors who owned the hotels, to national chains that operated multiple properties, to developers who extracted profit while reinvesting the minimum necessary to maintain operations. The permanent residents got by, certainly. Some prospered modestly, opening successful businesses that served both tourists and locals, accumulating enough to educate their children, to build comfortable homes, to achieve a version of middle-class stability. But they were building their futures on fundamentally unstable ground, and not just metaphorically, not just in the sense that all economic prosperity is vulnerable to shifts in taste and fortune, but literally, physically, in the most concrete possible way. The lake itself was changing, had been changing for years, in ways that anyone paying attention could not miss but that most people chose to ignore because acknowledging the change would require difficult decisions and expensive interventions. Unnoticed by most visitors who came for weeks and saw only pleasant water and healing properties, unmarked by the town's boosters who had every incentive to deny problems that might discourage tourism, Lago Epecuén was growing. A long-term weather pattern had been delivering far more rainfall than usual to the surrounding hills for years throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, part of natural climate variation that operates on timescales longer than human memory typically preserves. The lake, having no natural outlet, no river to drain excess water, could only expand. Water levels rose incrementally, season after season, centimeter by centimeter, a slow-motion crisis that unfolded too gradually to trigger immediate alarm. Engineers noticed. Local officials noticed. Anyone who had lived in Villa Epecuén for decades noticed that the beaches they remembered from childhood were now underwater, that the waterline kept creeping higher, that the lake was behaving differently than it had in living memory. There were discussions about reinforcing the dike that protected the town, about improving drainage, about building new infrastructure to manage the lake's expansion, about all the expensive, difficult interventions that might preserve Villa Epecuén's future. But these were expensive propositions requiring substantial investment, requiring capital that could otherwise generate profit, requiring the sacrifice of short-term returns for long-term security. And Villa Epecuén's success had bred a dangerous complacency, the kind of magical thinking that prosperity always encourages. The town had survived for 6 decades. Surely it would survive another. The waters had always been gentle, had always been manageable, had always been the source of prosperity rather than threat. Why divert substantial capital to address a problem that seemed theoretical, distant, manageable through hope and denial and the assumption that catastrophe always happens to someone else, somewhere else, never here, never to us? The 1980s arrived with economic turbulence across Argentina, convulsions that distracted attention from local concerns, that made the rising lake seem trivial compared to national crises. The country was emerging from military dictatorship, grappling with the aftermath of the Dirty War, processing trauma on a massive scale. It was navigating political instability as democracy returned without stable institutions to support it. It was fighting hyperinflation that destroyed savings and made long-term planning impossible, that created an atmosphere of perpetual crisis where everyone focused on immediate survival rather than future risks. Villa Epecuén still functioned, still drew tourists, but the golden age glow had begun to tarnish. Maintenance was deferred because funds were tight and priorities had shifted. Infrastructure aged without replacement because investing in the future seemed foolish when the present was so uncertain. The lake continued rising, lapping higher on the beaches each year, but this seemed a minor concern compared to broader national crises, a problem that could wait, that would somehow resolve itself, that surely was not as serious as pessimists claimed. By November 1985, Lago Epecuén had swollen significantly beyond its historical boundaries, had expanded to dimensions unprecedented in recorded history, was testing the limits of the infrastructure designed to contain it. The earthen dam and dike that protected Villa Epecuén were under increasing pressure, holding back millions of tons of hypersaline water, stressed beyond their design specifications, maintained inadequately, vulnerable in ways that experts understood but that no one with power to act seemed willing to address. The town was entering its summer season, preparing for the influx of tourists that would bring the year's profits, focused on the immediate business of hospitality rather than the abstract possibility of disaster. Then came November 6, 1985. A rare weather event, a seiche, struck the lake with the force of natural phenomena that care nothing for human plans or prayers. A seiche is a standing wave in an enclosed body of water, caused by atmospheric pressure changes, strong winds, or seismic activity, a phenomenon that transforms still water into a surging monster. The water in Lago Epecuén, already at historic highs, already pressing against its constraints, suddenly surged. The wave, massive and relentless, driven by forces beyond human control, slammed into the earthen dam with the accumulated weight of the entire lake behind it. The dam, poorly maintained, inadequately reinforced, built for conditions that no longer existed, built with the assumption that the lake would behave as it always had, could not hold. It broke. The earthen structure, which had seemed so solid, so permanent, so reliable, simply came apart, disintegrating under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Water poured through the breach, a brown wall of brine rushing toward Villa Epecuén, carrying with it the accumulated minerals of the lake, carrying the weight of all those years of rising water, carrying the price of all that deferred maintenance and denied risk. The water surged toward the dike that was Villa Epecuén's last defense, the final barrier between the town and the lake, the structure that everyone had assumed would protect them indefinitely. The dike, never designed to withstand such force, never imagined having to hold back the entire lake, crumpled within hours. The water found every weakness, every poorly compacted section, every design flaw, and exploited them all simultaneously, overwhelming the structure not gradually but in a catastrophic cascade of failure. The flood that followed was not sudden apocalypse, not the dramatic inundation of movie disasters where everything changes in minutes. It was slow doom, which in many ways was worse, was more psychologically devastating, gave people time to watch everything they had built slowly disappear without being able to stop it. The water rose progressively, for feet in the first days, then higher still, advancing with the inexorable patience of natural forces that cannot be negotiated with or delayed or diverted by human will. 1,500 residents had time to evacuate, gathering what they could carry, making desperate decisions about what to save and what to abandon, watching from higher ground as the salt water consumed their homes, their businesses, their entire way of life. The flood was thorough but gradual, giving them time to escape with their lives but not time to save anything substantial, not the furniture that had been in families for generations, not the photographs that documented their histories, not the businesses they had built from nothing, not the structures that embodied their labor and dreams. They watched the water rise for days, then weeks, then months, standing on hilltops and rooftops and any elevation they could find, witnessing the systematic erasure of their world. First the streets flooded, water flowing down familiar paths they had walked thousands of times. Then the first floors disappeared, water rising up walls, entering through doors and windows, filling rooms where they had lived their lives. Then second floors vanished, then roofs, then only the tallest structures remained visible, islands in an expanding sea, until finally even those disappeared and Villa Epecuén existed only underwater, only in memory, only as a wound that would never fully heal. By 1993, 8 years after the initial flood, Villa Epecuén lay under 10 meters, 33 feet, of salt water. The entire town, everything they had built over 6 decades, every structure that had housed their lives and livelihoods, was submerged beneath a gray-green surface that stretched to the horizon, that reflected sky and clouds, that gave no indication of the drowned world beneath. The weight of that water did terrible things, inflicted damage that went far beyond simple submersion. Salt water is corrosive in ways fresh water is not, attacks materials that fresh water would simply saturate. The minerals that had once drawn tourists for healing now became agents of destruction, chemical weapons attacking everything they touched. Wooden structures dissolved, wood fibers breaking down under the assault of salt and water and time, collapsing into themselves, becoming unrecognizable. Metal corroded spectacularly, rust spreading like cancer, eating through steel and iron, transforming solid objects into fragile shells that crumbled at the slightest pressure. Concrete cracked and crumbled, the water finding every weakness, every air pocket, every imperfection in the mixing, exploiting them all, reducing supposed permanence to rubble. Paint peeled away in great sheets, exposing bare walls to further assault, creating abstract patterns of destruction. Windows shattered under pressure, glass that had framed views of lake and sky and daily life exploding inward, adding shards to the debris accumulating on floors that no one walked anymore. Roofs collapsed under the weight of water above and the deterioration of supporting structures below, creating jagged silhouettes that served as markers for buildings whose functions were no longer identifiable. Trees died, their roots poisoned by salt concentrations no plant could survive, their trunks becoming bleached monuments to a forest that no longer existed, standing corpses that would remain upright for decades, testimony to what had been. The water preserved nothing and destroyed everything, slowly, inexorably, year after year, working with the infinite patience of natural processes that operate on their own timelines without regard for human urgency or grief. For a quarter century, Villa Epecuén ceased to exist above the waterline. It became a memory, a tragedy, a cautionary tale whispered in nearby Kara where some evacuees had fled, where they tried to rebuild lives from nothing, where they carried the trauma of watching their entire world drown in slow motion, of being powerless to stop it, of understanding with terrible clarity that everything they had assumed was permanent had been temporary all along. The 1,500 former residents scattered across Argentina, finding work where they could, taking whatever jobs were available, starting over in middle age or old age, rebuilding from nothing with the knowledge that nothing they rebuilt would ever replace what they lost. They carried the memory of Villa Epecuén with them, told their children and grandchildren about the town that drowned, tried to explain what it felt like to lose not just a home but an entire community, an entire way of life, in a disaster that could have been prevented with better planning, better maintenance, better priorities. But water, like ambition, like human fortune, is not static, does not remain in one configuration forever. The same weather patterns that had flooded Villa Epecuén eventually reversed, part of the same natural cycles that had created the flood in the first place. Drier seasons arrived. Rainfall decreased. Lago Epecuén began to recede, slowly at first, then more rapidly, reversing the process that had taken years to complete. In 2009, after 25 years of submersion, after an entire generation had passed without seeing Villa Epecuén above water, the ruins began to emerge. First the tallest structures, their upper floors appearing like islands, strange formations rising from the water, their purpose unclear to anyone who had not known the town before. Then rooflines became visible, walls emerged, streets reappeared, the town's layout becoming recognizable again, though everything else had been fundamentally transformed. The town that had drowned was exhaling, revealing what the water had done, showing the price of a quarter-century underwater. What emerged was haunting beyond words, beyond any artistic rendering of apocalypse, beyond imagination's capacity to fully anticipate. A landscape rendered in whites and grays and muted browns, every surface crusted with crystallized salt, everything covered in mineral deposits that created alien textures, that made the familiar unrecognizable. Buildings stood partially collapsed, their walls bowed outward by years of water pressure, their structures compromised, their integrity destroyed, existing in states of suspended collapse where gravity seemed ready to complete what water had started. Metal objects had been transformed beyond recognition. Cars, farm equipment, industrial machinery, the tools and vehicles that had facilitated daily life, had become rust sculptures, abstract forms that suggested their original purposes without clearly revealing them, archaeological artifacts from a civilization that had ended only decades ago. Trees stood completely bare, every leaf and branch stripped away, leaving only white skeletal trunks and limbs reaching toward empty sky in postures that suggested agony, that looked like permanent screaming. That created ghost forests where forests had actually stood. The town's layout was still visible from above, streets still traced their original paths, the logic of urban planning still evident, but everything else had been fundamentally altered, transformed from living town into dead monument, from functioning community into archaeological site, from home into ruin. In 2009, as the ruins emerged, one man made a decision that seemed to everyone who knew him either profoundly moving or completely insane. Pablo Novak was born in Villa Epecuén in 1930, had lived most of his life there, had experienced the town's golden age, had known it when it was alive and prosperous and full of promise. He had witnessed its drowning, had evacuated with everyone else in 1985, had spent 25 years living elsewhere, building a life in a different place, accepting that Villa Epecuén was gone forever. He was 79 years old when the ruins emerged from the receding waters, an old man by any measure, an age when most people seek comfort and security rather than adventure and hardship. But Pablo Novak made a decision that baffled his family and acquaintances, that seemed to reject every conventional wisdom about aging and safety and reasonable behavior. He moved back. He returned to Villa Epecuén, or rather to the salt-encrusted ruins of where Villa Epecuén had been, and he rebuilt just enough structure to survive. He scavenged materials from the ruins, constructed a small shelter, established a space where he could live, if living is defined loosely enough to include existing in isolation among ruins with minimal resources and no community. He became Villa Epecuén's sole resident, the only person living in a town built for thousands, the loneliest man in Argentina, perhaps the loneliest man anywhere. He lived there among the ruins, tending a wood stove that provided heat and cooking fire, growing a small garden in soil he painstakingly desalinated by hauling fresh water and leaching the salt through repeated soaking and draining. A labor-intensive process that yielded small returns but gave him purpose and food and connection to the earth. He greeted the first curious visitors who began arriving to photograph the apocalyptic landscape, answered their questions with the patience of someone who had decided his purpose was witnessing and testifying, who understood that he had become a living bridge between Villa Epecuén's past and its strange present. He lived there through heat and cold, through summers when the sun was merciless and winters when the wind cut through the ruins without resistance, through days when tourists arrived and days when he saw no one, through the slow accumulation of years that added up to 15 years of solitary existence in a ghost town. Why did he return? Journalists asked him this repeatedly over those years, seeking to understand what drove a man to choose isolation and hardship over comfort and community. His answers varied depending on mood and audience and how many times he had already been asked that day, but certain themes emerged consistently. Villa Epecuén was home, he said, regardless of its condition, regardless of how different it looked from his memories, regardless of how much had been destroyed. The place that had been his entire world still existed, altered but recognizable, dead but not gone. He could walk streets where he had played as a child, following paths his feet knew even when his eyes struggled to recognize the surroundings. He could stand on corners where he had conducted business as an adult, where he had shaken hands and made deals and participated in the economy of a living town. He could visit ruins of buildings where friends had lived, where he had been invited for meals, where he had celebrated holidays and mourned losses. The town was dead, yes, unmistakably dead, but it was not gone, and that distinction mattered profoundly to Pablo Novak, mattered in ways that people who have not lost everything struggle to understand. That he became a living bridge between Villa Epecuén's past and its strange present, answering questions for visitors, sharing memories that would otherwise die with him, posing for photographs beside rust and ruin, allowing his image to become part of the story that tourists told about their visit to this apocalyptic landscape. He appeared in documentaries, in news reports, in photography projects, always as the same figure, the old man who returned, the sole resident, the keeper of memory in a place that had forgotten itself. He lived there until 2024, dying at age 94, having spent the last 15 years of his life as custodian of a ghost town, as witness to both what had been and what remained, as proof that human attachment to place transcends rationality, that home means something that cannot be destroyed by water or time or the transformation of prosperity into ruin. But Pablo Novak was not Villa Epecuén's only visitor, was not the only person drawn to these ruins, though he was the only one who stayed. As word spread about the ruins through social media and photography websites and travel blogs, as images circulated online showing this otherworldly landscape of salt and destruction in ghost forests, tourists began arriving in numbers that grew year over year. First in trickles, small groups of adventurous travelers seeking places off the conventional tourist circuit. Then in significant numbers as tour operators recognized opportunity and began offering organized visits. By 2015, thousands visited annually, a respectable number for such a remote location. By 2020, despite or perhaps because of its remoteness, despite or perhaps because of the difficulty of reaching it, that number had swelled to 25,000 visitors per year, matching almost exactly the number who had visited during the town's summer peak in the 1970s. But these were not tourists seeking healing, not visitors hoping for therapeutic transformation, not people coming to soak in mineral waters and emerge renewed. They were seeking something darker, more complex, harder to articulate but unmistakable in its pull. They came to witness catastrophe made tangible, to walk through ruin that was recent enough to feel connected to the present rather than safely distant in historical time. They came to take photographs of destruction, to capture images of apocalyptic landscapes that would generate social media engagement, that would mark them as travelers who sought authentic experiences rather than conventional destinations. They came because Villa Epecuén had become something more valuable than a resort town, something more marketable than healing waters. It had become a symbol, an aesthetic experience, a place where the photogenic qualities of decay could be consumed without the discomfort of recent tragedy, where catastrophe had been rendered safe for tourism. What does Villa Epecuén symbolize in its current incarnation? Walk through the ruins and the answers multiply, proliferate, contradict each other in ways that reveal more about the visitors than about the place itself. There is the obvious lesson about hubris, about building on unstable foundations, about ignoring warning signs because prosperity makes us complacent, because acknowledging risk requires uncomfortable action, because denial is easier than preparation until the moment disaster arrives and denial becomes impossible. The lake was rising for years, visible to anyone who looked, measurable by anyone with instruments, undeniable to anyone willing to see. But addressing that reality would have required money and effort and political will and the sacrifice of short-term profits for long-term security. Easier to hope, to assume, to defer action until action becomes impossible, until the only choice left is evacuation and loss. There is also the lesson about class and labor, about who bears the cost when systems fail, about whose lives are disrupted and whose remain comfortable when catastrophe strikes. The wealthy visitors from Buenos Aires lost vacation homes, weekend retreats, places they visited occasionally for pleasure but that were not central to their existence or identity. They lost investments, certainly, lost property and the money spent acquiring it, but they did not lose their lives in any fundamental sense. The 1,500 permanent residents lost everything that mattered. They lost their homes, the physical spaces where they had lived their daily lives, where they had raised children and grown old and accumulated the objects that made existence comfortable and familiar. They lost their jobs, the work that provided income and purpose and structure to their days. They lost their community, the web of relationships that sustained them, the neighbors and friends and familiar faces that constituted their social world. They lost their entire way of life, everything that gave their existence meaning and continuity. Where was the compensation for these losses? Where was the support system that should have existed for people whose lives were destroyed by infrastructure failure? The answer is there was none, or there was so little as to be effectively meaningless. They scattered and rebuilt alone because that is what working people do when structures collapse around them, because no one is coming to save them, because the systems designed to extract their labor during prosperity do not exist to protect them during catastrophe. This is the dark truth that Villa Epecuén reveals to anyone willing to see it. The costs of failure are borne by those least able to afford them, while those who profited from the system that failed escape relatively unscathed. There is the lesson about environmental exploitation, about extractive relationships with nature, about the consequences of treating natural resources as commodities that exist solely for human benefit. Villa Epecuén's entire existence depended on extracting value from Lago Epecuén's mineral properties while giving nothing back, while treating the lake as a resource to be marketed rather than a natural system to be respected. The town was built on the principle that nature exists to serve human desires, that lakes are products to be sold, that the land owes us prosperity and will provide it indefinitely if we market it correctly. The flood can be read as a settling of accounts, nature reclaiming what was taken, water asserting its dominance over the structures we arrogantly believed were permanent. This reading is poetic but incomplete, satisfying in its narrative symmetry but inaccurate in its attribution of intention. Nature does not punish. Nature does not judge. Nature simply is, operating according to physical laws that care nothing for human morality or justice. The flood happened because of weather patterns and inadequate infrastructure, because of natural cycles and human failure, not because the universe decided Villa Epecuén deserved destruction. But here is the darkest lesson, the one that makes Villa Epecuén genuinely disturbing rather than merely sad, the insight that transforms these ruins from tragedy into something more unsettling. The town's resurrection as a tourist destination, its commercial success based precisely on its destruction. 25,000 people now visit annually to photograph ruin, to walk through catastrophe rendered safe, to experience the aesthetic pleasure of decay without having to live through the trauma that created it. There are tour guides explaining what happened in simplified narratives suitable for groups of 20. There are entrance fees charged by nearby Cairo, monetizing access to ruins. There are gift shops selling postcards of salt-encrusted buildings and skeletal trees, allowing visitors to take home commodified images of others' tragedy. Villa Epecuén failed as a resort town, drowned, emerged destroyed, and immediately became profitable again precisely because of its destruction, because of its transformation into ruin. Catastrophe is marketable. Apocalypse is photogenic. The very trauma that devastated 1,500 lives has become entertainment for 25,000 visitors per year, has become an economic resource that benefits everyone except the people who actually suffered the loss. What does that say about us, about our culture, about our relationship to suffering? What does it reveal about how we consume tragedy, how we aestheticize loss, how we transform others' pain into our own pleasure. These are uncomfortable questions that most visitors never ask, that would ruin the experience if examined too closely, that challenge the innocent enjoyment of spectacular ruins. But they hover over Villa Epecuén nonetheless, unavoidable for anyone willing to think critically about what they are doing there, about what it means to visit a place where people lost everything, to photograph the physical evidence of their loss, to enjoy the experience enough to recommend it to others, to return home with images that mark us as adventurous travelers who seek authentic experiences. The ruins today attract a particular type of visitor, or perhaps they attract all types of visitors, but certain types are more visible, more vocal, more present in the way they document their experience. Urban explorers arrive documenting forgotten places, adding Villa Epecuén to portfolios of abandoned sites, treating it as content for websites and videos that rack up views and generate revenue. Photographers come seeking dramatic landscapes for Instagram and other social platforms, composing shots carefully, waiting for the right light, returning multiple times to capture the perfect image that will generate likes and comments and the social capital of appearing interesting. Artists arrive drawn to the visual power of decay, to the textures and colors that emerge when human structures break down, when salt transforms surfaces, when destruction creates unintended beauty. General tourists come because they have heard this is a place worth visiting, because it appears on lists of Argentina's most unusual destinations, because it offers something genuinely strange, genuinely unlike anywhere else, genuinely memorable, and they all find what they came for, because Villa Epecuén delivers on its apocalyptic promise. The place is genuinely spectacular in its desolation, genuinely moving in its strangeness, genuinely unlike anywhere else most people have ever been. The salt incrustation creates textures and colors unlike anything in conventional experience, transforming ordinary materials into extraordinary surfaces. Everything is white or gray or rust orange, an entire town bleached of color, reduced to tonal variations, existing in a palette that seems deliberately artistic but is simply the result of minerals doing what minerals do. The dead tree forest is particularly striking, hundreds of bare trunks standing in formations that seem intentional but are simply the pattern of where trees once grew, their branches creating intricate patterns against the sky, their wood bleached pale by salt and sun and years of exposure. The collapsed buildings offer endless compositions for photographers, walls standing at impossible angles, defying gravity in ways that make viewers question whether the images have been manipulated, rooms open to the elements, their interiors exposed like dollhouses, revealing the layouts of lives that are no longer lived, staircases interrupted mid-flight, leading to floors that no longer exist, going nowhere, doorways framing views of nothing, creating portals that once marked transitions between spaces but now mark only absence. The place is undeniably beautiful in its way, beautiful in the manner of ruins throughout history, beautiful because destruction creates accidental art, because entropy generates patterns human artists spend careers trying to replicate. But beauty and exploitation are not mutually exclusive, are not opposite ends of a spectrum but rather two aspects of the same experience. Villa Epecuén can be genuinely haunting, genuinely moving, genuinely beautiful in its desolation while simultaneously functioning as consumption of others' tragedy, as extraction of meaning and experience from a catastrophe that destroyed lives. These truths coexist uncomfortably, creating moral ambiguity that cannot be resolved through simple judgments, that requires holding contradictions simultaneously. The 1,500 residents who lost everything did not choose to create an art installation about loss and impermanence, did not intend their catastrophe to become an aesthetic experience for others, did not consent to having their tragedy transformed into a tourist attraction. They wanted to continue living in their town, working their jobs, raising their families in the place they called home, accumulating the ordinary experiences that constitute a life. Their catastrophe has been repurposed as spectacle without their consent, transformed into an economic resource that benefits tour operators, nearby hotels, gift shops, everyone except the people who actually suffered the loss. This is extractive in precisely the way Villa Epecuén's original relationship with the lake was extractive, taking value while giving nothing back, treating human tragedy as raw material to be processed and sold. There is one more figure who must be mentioned in Villa Epecuén's story, one more voice that speaks to the experience of those who lived through the drowning. In 2011, photographer Juan Mabromeda captured Norma Berg standing beside the ruins of her family home, creating an image that circulated widely, that became iconic in its representation of loss. The photograph shows an older woman, her face marked by time and sun and the accumulated experiences of a hard life, gesturing toward collapsed walls and empty spaces where rooms once stood. Her body language suggests explanation, the physical act of describing something that no longer exists to someone who cannot see it, who can only imagine based on her words and gestures. She had grown up in Villa Epecuén, had absorbed its patterns and rhythms into her identity, had raised her own family there, passing on the connection to place that anchors human existence. She had evacuated in 1985 and never returned permanently, could not or would not rebuild a life in the ruins, chose survival elsewhere over witnessing in place, but she visited sometimes, making the journey from wherever she had resettled, walking through what remained, running her hands over salt-encrusted walls, standing in spaces that once had roofs and purposes. She showed journalists and photographers where her house had stood, described what the street had looked like when it was alive with children playing and neighbors talking and the ordinary traffic of daily life. She tried to convey what had been lost, what could not be photographed or documented or fully communicated to people who had not experienced it, who knew Villa Epecuén only as ruins, who could not imagine it alive. There is something unbearably poignant about these visits, about returning to a place that looks nothing like memory, about standing in ruins and trying to explain what once was to people who can only see what is, about bearing witness to absence. The contrast between Pablo Novak and Norma Berg is instructive, revealing the range of responses to catastrophic loss, the variety of ways human beings process trauma. Novak returned and stayed, choosing solitude among ruins over comfort elsewhere, making Villa Epecuén his entire world again despite or perhaps because of its transformation. Berg visited but did not return, could not or would not rebuild a life in the catastrophe's aftermath, chose to preserve her memories rather than confront their ruins. Both responses are valid. Both are traumatic. Both reveal deep attachment to place and profound grief at its loss. There is no correct way to process the drowning of your entire world, no proper response to watching everything you built slowly disappear underwater. People cope as they can, make the choices available to them, survive in whatever ways their psyches and circumstances allow, but the broader world did not care about their processing, their grief, their choices, their individual responses to collective tragedy. The broader world saw ruins and wanted photographs, wanted stories, wanted the experience of walking through catastrophe without having lived through it, wanted the emotional resonance without the actual trauma. This is what makes Villa Epecuén's current existence so deeply ambiguous, so morally complex. The place serves a purpose, provides value, creates experiences that visitors describe as meaningful, but none of that value flows back to those who lost everything, none of that meaning acknowledges their suffering except as historical context for present consumption. Today, Villa Epecuén exists in a strange liminal state between death and afterlife, between abandonment and preservation, between forgotten and famous. It is not alive but not fully dead, not functioning as a town but not completely erased. It is a town without residents except for the 25,000 annual visitors who pass through, take photographs, leave, treating it as a destination rather than a home, as an experience rather than a place where people lived. The local government in Kara has designated it a protected area, preventing further development or salvage, preserving the ruins as they are, maintaining them through benign neglect rather than active intervention. This is presented as cultural preservation, as recognizing historical significance, as protecting an important site, but preservation for what purpose? For whom? The people who live there do not benefit from its preservation. The ruins are maintained not for them, not to honor their memory or acknowledge their loss, but for tourists, for outsiders, for the continued consumption of their tragedy. Villa Epecuén is preserved because ruined Villa Epecuén is more valuable than cleared land, because the catastrophe is marketable in ways that recovery never could be. This is the ultimate irony, the final twist in Villa Epecuén's story. The town was built to serve outsiders, to provide healing and leisure to Buenos Aires visitors, to extract wealth through service. It failed, drowned, emerged destroyed, and immediately resumed serving outsiders, providing dramatic backdrops for photography and the frisson of walking through recent catastrophe. The town has never existed for its own sake, for its residents, for the people who actually live there. It has always been extraction, always been exploitation, first of the lake's minerals, then of workers' labor, now of trauma itself as aesthetic experience. The only thing that has changed is the product being sold, first healing, now haunting, and yet. There is something undeniably powerful about Villa Epecuén's ruins, something that transcends the problematic aspects of its current existence as tourist destination. Standing there, surrounded by salt-encrusted desolation, confronting the physical evidence of impermanence, of how quickly prosperity can turn to catastrophe, of how nature reclaims everything we build, there is a kind of terrible clarity that emerges. We build on unstable ground, all of us, everywhere, always. We construct lives and communities on foundations that could shift or crumble at any moment, and we do so knowing this fragility intellectually while refusing to believe it emotionally, while proceeding as though permanence is possible, as though security can be achieved, as though the future we envision will actually arrive intact. Villa Epecuén forces confrontation with that truth. Here is a town that thrived for 60 years, that seemed permanent, that contained entire universes of human experience, lives and loves and losses and all the ordinary extraordinary moments that constitute existence, and it was erased in months, destroyed in years, transformed into something unrecognizable by forces that gave no warning adequate to prepare anyone for what was coming. The lesson is not that we should not build, should not invest, should not create communities and futures and structures that house our dreams. The lesson is that we must build with humility, with acknowledgement of precariousness, with systems that protect the vulnerable when structures fail, with recognition that the ground beneath us is always unstable in some way, that the waters are always rising somewhere. That catastrophe is always possible and often preventable if we choose to see risk rather than deny it. Villa Epecuén did not have to drown. With proper investment in infrastructure, with adequate maintenance, with systems that prioritized human life over profit, with decision-making that valued long-term security over short-term returns, the town might have survived the rising waters. The engineering was possible. The interventions were known. The money existed somewhere in the system. But that would have required acknowledging risk, admitting vulnerability, diverting capital from profit to protection, making choices that capitalist systems do not make easily or willingly because quarterly returns matter more than decade-long security, because showing immediate profit matters more than preventing distant catastrophe. What remains now in Villa Epecuén? Salt and rust and ghost forests, staircases to nowhere, walls standing impossibly, doorways framing absence. A landscape that looks like the end of the world, like what remains after apocalypse, like proof that everything ends eventually no matter how permanent it seems. Tourists walking through ruins with cameras, seeking the perfect composition, capturing images to prove they were there, to document their experience of experiencing others' catastrophe. Gift shops selling postcards that reduce complex tragedy to simple images. Tour guides explaining what happened, reducing layers of loss to narratives suitable for groups of 20 who have 90 minutes to spend before moving to the next destination. Pablo Novak is gone now, died in 2024, the last resident who remembered Villa Epecuén's living days, the final voice that could speak from experience rather than imagination. When the current generation of survivors dies, the people who actually lived there, who evacuated in 1985 carrying what they could grab, who rebuilt lives from nothing, who carry the trauma in their bodies and memories, when they are gone, Villa Epecuén will become pure abstraction, pure symbol, unmoored from lived experience, existing only as ruin and metaphor, but perhaps that is the final transformation, the ultimate resurrection, the last stage in Villa Epecuén's strange evolution. It began as indigenous sacred space, water that healed, legend made physical. It became a resort town, capital made solid, ambition transformed into structures and systems. It drowned into silence, became absence, ceased to exist above the waterline for a quarter century. It emerged as ruins, death made visible, catastrophe preserved. And now it exists as mirror, reflecting back whatever we bring to it, revealing what we choose to see, functioning as screen onto which we project our fears and insights and aesthetic preferences and moral frameworks. Do we see human hubris reflected in these ruins? Evidence of climate vulnerability? The aesthetics of decay? The exploitation of tragedy. The impermanence of all things. The cost of deferred maintenance. The consequences of class inequality. Yes. All of those. Villa Epecuén is large enough, strange enough, ambiguous enough to contain all these interpretations simultaneously, to mean different things to different visitors, to serve as symbol of whatever lesson we need to learn or want to believe. The forgotten dynasty behind these ruins is not a family or a corporation but an entire class structure, an entire economic system that builds prosperity on extraction and abandons the vulnerable when systems fail, that socializes costs while privatizing profits, that treats workers as resources rather than humans, that values property over people until property fails and then offers nothing to those whose lives depended on it. The developers are forgotten, the English entrepreneur who started it all, the hotel owners who extracted profits during good years, the investors who diversified away from Villa Epecuén before the catastrophe. They moved on long ago, capital following opportunity elsewhere, finding new places to extract value, new workers to exploit, new systems to profit from until those systems fail and they move again, but the workers remain in memory, in Norma Berg's photographs, in Pablo Novak's solitary return, in the scattered descendants of those 1,500 residents who lost everything, who carry Villa Epecuén's story not as tourist attraction but as wound. They are the ones who paid the price, who bore the cost, who lost everything while others lost comparatively little. They are the invisible hands that made Villa Epecuén function during its golden age, that cleaned and cooked and maintained and served, that provided the labor that made tourism possible, that generated the profits that flowed elsewhere. And they are the forgotten ones, the unnamed multitude whose catastrophe has become our entertainment, whose loss has become our aesthetic experience, whose ruins we photograph without asking what those ruins mean to the people who lived in them when they were homes rather than tourist attractions. Stand in those ruins at sunset, as the light turns everything golden against the white salt and gray rubble, and you can almost hear what the place was if you listen carefully enough, if you silence the noise of present tourism and open yourself to ghosts. The laughter of children playing in impossibly buoyant water, their voices carrying across the lake. The negotiations in hotel lobbies between guests and staff, the careful dance of service that maintained the illusion of effortless hospitality. The clatter of restaurant kitchens during summer rush, cooks working in oppressive heat to serve meals to guests who complained about trivial imperfections. The quiet conversations between workers at shift end, sharing grievances and jokes that only they understood, building solidarity that helped them survive. The prayers in churches where people sought meaning beyond tourism and economics. The arguments in homes between spouses and siblings and parents and children, the everyday conflicts that are proof of genuine life rather than performance. The everyday noise of a living place, the soundscape of community, all of it drowned, buried, erased, leaving only this strange resurrection, this zombie town that moves but is not alive, that draws crowds but houses no one, that functions but does not live. Is their hope in Villa Epecuén's story? Not hope in the conventional sense, not the hope of restoration or redemption, not the possibility that the town will somehow return to its former glory or that those who lost everything will be compensated adequately. That hope is dead, drowned as thoroughly as the town itself. But perhaps there is hope of a different kind, the hope of recognition, of understanding what we are building and what it rests upon, of acknowledging the people whose labor creates prosperity and the structures needed to protect them when that prosperity evaporates. Perhaps the hope that someday we will build towns not just to extract value but to sustain life, not just to serve tourists but to house communities, not just to generate profit but to create places worth preserving not as ruins but as living, breathing, functioning human spaces. Perhaps the hope that someday we will look at rising water and see warning rather than problem to ignore, will choose maintenance over profit, will value human security over quarterly returns, will build systems that acknowledge vulnerability rather than deny it until denial becomes catastrophe. Until then, Villa Epecuén stands as it is, a magnificent, haunting, terrible reminder that everything we build is borrowed time, that the water always rises eventually, that nature always reclaims what we take, and that the stories we tell about ruins say more about us than about the places themselves. The town drowned. The town emerged. The town serves its purpose still, just a different purpose than its builders intended, a darker purpose that reveals uncomfortable truths about how we consume tragedy and aestheticize loss. And 25,000 tourists visit each year, cameras ready, eager to photograph the beautiful. Terrible truth that Villa Epecuén offers freely to anyone willing to see it. We are all building on unstable ground, the flood is always coming, what remains when the waters recede is never what we hoped, and the only question that matters is whether we will learn from ruins or simply photograph them and move on to the next destination, the next experience, the next consumption of others' catastrophe dressed up as meaningful travel.